Hi, good evening from Hong Kong. My name is Jennifer Creary. I'm the Claire Hollingworth Fellow at the FCC, also a content editor at the Financial Times. Thank you for joining us for our conversation about Asian hate in America, where we'll be looking at some of the state of anti-Asian hate crimes and the events going on in the US. But before I introduce and welcome back some of our speakers, I want to encourage you all to check us out on fcc.hk.org for all of our upcoming events. So we've got an online Zoom event on Friday about the inside story of Instagram and Mark Zuckerberg's quest to rule the social world. And that's with Sarah Fryer. She's a Bloomberg journalist and award-winning author of No Filter, the inside story of Instagram. That should be an interesting talk. That's on Friday at 8 a.m. Hong Kong time. So that'll be an evening in the US. We also have another Zoom event on Monday. That's Monday the 29th at 8 p.m. Hong Kong time. And that's about the Belt and Road initiative, what's next for Xi Jinping's signature project. Well, we'll be talking about Beijing's effort to shift the world's power dynamics in its favor using the initiative, and we'll be welcoming Jonathan Hillman, author of The Emperor's New Road, China and the Project of the Century, Nargis Casanova, senior fellow and director of the program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, as well as James Wang, research director of the Bay Area Hong Kong Center. But for now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. We've got Eileen Chow, the director of the Chung Chih-hua Institute of Chinese Journalism at Shuqing University in Taipei. She co-directs the Biographical Literature Press and its Chinese language history journal, Biographical Literature. She's also a visiting professor at Duke University. We've also got Michelle Lee, a reporter with the Washington Post covering the State Department and diplomacy. Before joining the Post, she was a government accountability reporter at the Arizona Republic in Phoenix. Michelle is also the president of the Asian American Journalists Association, and from this summer, she'll serve as the Post's Tokyo bureau chief. And Jiayang Fan, who will be hopefully joining us later, is a staff writer for The New Yorker. She was born in Chongqing and moved to the US when she was 8. She's currently working on her first book titled Motherland, which should be out in 2023. Moderating today's talk is Eric Wishart, first vice president at the FCC and with AAPI. And please send any questions that you have to the email address question@fcc.org.hk. That's singular, question@fcc.org.hk. And with that, I'll pass on to Eric, who will kick us off.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good evening, everybody, and good morning, stateside. Before we start the discussion, I would just like to quote some figures from the Stop Asian American Pacific Islander Hate National Report, which just came out. It's from the March 19, 2020 to February 28, 2021. And it said that there was a total of 3,795 anti-Asian American incidents reported in the United States. And that is just, it says it's just a small percentage. There were twice the number of incidents involving women than men reported, and 10% were actually physical assaults, not just online. So, so this is a real crisis in the United States, which has obviously been highlighted in the past week with the killings in Atlanta. So I'd like to begin with Eileen. Thank you for joining us. And just a kind of broad question, what's it like being an Asian American and an Asian American woman in the United States of 2021?
Thank you for having me. That is a big question, but I think that it's important to think about what does it mean to be Asian American even before 2021. Of course, this has been a really, really sad week for all my Asian friends and the community. But I think that it certainly didn't come as a great surprise. I think a lot of people within the Asian American community was waiting for the the shoe to drop, right? That this has been a kind of escalating sense of violence, not only in the past months, as you mentioned in the statistics, but also in the past, in the Trump administration, because of the Kung Flu, China virus discourse. But even in 2015, I remember very clearly that when there was news to kind of foster a new mode of Muslim ban, which was enacted in January 2017, it was, in fact, the Japanese incarceration during World War II was cited as a shining positive example of what we could do, we as a country. And it was really shocking to those of us who thought that was, if there were people who thought that was in the distant past and seen as something to the US government should be apologizing for, which in fact Reagan did. And so how is it that suddenly in 2015 and 16, this was coming back as a right-wing talking point about, wow, this might be a good model on how to treat, immigrants that we feel suspicious about. And so but that also was not a surprise then either. Maybe just a little startling that that discourse had come back into the mainstream, but it was there all along. And it's been in the US long before the US was the US. And long before California was California. When we talk about Chinese Exclusion Act as beginning really as a kind of ploy to win the white labor vote by saying, we will protect you against these foreign heathens who are out to steal your job. But by the time that the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was deployed, you could say, as a kind of political wedge policy and enacted into law, there was already a long history before that. So I guess the answer about how's it feel in 2021, angry, sad, unsurprised, but also galvanizing, right? That I think, I've been really inspired by Michelle's coverage and AAJA in the way that so many journalists have stood out, so many scholars, so many people have come out to really speak on the subject, and so many activists who have been working for decades and decades now getting to be heard on mainstream platforms. So in that sense, also energizing, right? Also energizing amidst grief to be able to talk about these things in the open.
And I mean, personally, how do you identify yourself? I mean, in America, the thing that always strikes me in America is it's so, hi, morning, Jiayang, welcome. You're muted. You're muted. Can't hear. Anyway, that's okay. No, Eileen, I was just going to ask you, and the thing that always strikes, they talk about America being a melting pot, where in fact, I've never seen a society so defined by who you are and where you come from. I mean, down to sort of micro analysis. And if you ever watched John King and CNN, as you know, in the voting. So how do you self-identify? I mean, I saw an interview, I think it was with Tom Ashcroft quite recently, and you said you identify yourself as Asian American, but not Chinese American. Can you maybe elaborate on that a bit?
Sure, but I was going to say those are tall words coming from someone coming from the UK, right? So, in terms of, I guess first off, I would say just briefly that how one identifies is so much a factor of many things, and very quickly, one, as you heard me talk about with Tom, but so much of it is both. Do you think of it as ontological? Is it something that you are or something that you own, a possession? And if it's a possession, is it something you can lose? Is it something you can shed easily like clothes, or is it something you work at like muscles? I think secondly, it's also a question of who you think you are versus who other people think you are. I may think of myself, as I said, not particularly as Chinese American, but Asian American, but do those distinctions matter when push comes to shove and someone wants to put me in a particular box and kill me or shoot me or beat me or curse at me, right? Does it matter? Like when it, and I think, so that negotiation between who I think I am and what other people want to impose on me is always a question of identification in the US. The third is, I think, Asian identity and all identities in the US, but especially Asian identity, is subject to how people think about Asia, right? So Asian American identity is never seen as somehow identity within the US, but it's always about what kind of geopolitical moment and tension or chumminess we are with the rest of the world, with Asia, with China, with Korea, with Japan, etc. And the people who happen to be in the US, whether they be new immigrants or fifth generation, they're always subject to that moment. I think everybody knows the Japanese American World War II incarceration as one of those examples. But I think right now we're also seeing the rising tension of US and China and the way it kind of spills over to Asian American identity, not just Chinese American, right? So, and the fourth thing is, I think identity is based on narrative. So if you don't see stories, you don't hear stories, you're not able to have a platform to tell the stories of who you are, then who are you? And I think that's why when people mildly deride Asian American, especially sort of elite Asian Americans, to call it my students as boba liberals, or kind of, part of focusing too much on representation and food and whatnot. But what they're responding to is really, we don't have stories that showcase us, and maybe food is one of the ways that Chineseness or Asianness gets showcased in America. So it's not surprising that people embrace that. So that's a long roundabout way to answer your question, which is really saying that identify with Asian American because it's a political identity. It's an identity forged in the 1960s in alliance with other ethnic identities in the US, and it's about making change and making noise and declaring one's belonging in the US. I also think melting pot itself is, deeply questionable, but that's another story for another time. But I do think that in that sense, it's a very historically and politically located identity, rather than just a more amorphous sense of, where's your family from, or what is your country of origin, right? It's about what happens when you get there. And I think Asian Americans, no matter where you're from, recognize that it's about the push comes to shove moment.
Okay, thanks. Michelle, I think you're wearing two hats tonight, the Asian American Journalists Association and also the AAJA and also Washington Post. So I would like to ask you a question about AAJA. For those of you, that are viewers who are not familiar with it, and I would like to welcome members of the AAJA who signed up to tonight's event in Asia. So could you just explain a bit about the work and how you place the AAJA in this context of anti-Asian hate in the United States?
Yes, of course. Thanks for having me. I'm actually in Atlanta right now in my hotel room. I'm here for the shooting. So hello from Atlanta. AAJA is a professional nonprofit for journalists and now allies of our mission. We're dedicated to making sure that Asian American journalists and Pacific Islander journalists are represented in the newsroom, that we have more AAPIs covering the news, and that news coverage of AAPI communities is accurate and fair and comprehensive. We have roughly 1,800 members across the country and all over Asia, including in Hong Kong. And we were founded in 1981. So we're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. We have, a big part of what we do is hold newsrooms accountable for their coverage of AAPI communities. So in February 2020, just over a year ago, we came out very early with guidance for newsrooms covering COVID outbreak out of China, because we saw US newsrooms were writing about the coronavirus and using images of US Chinatowns as the stock image of articles about coronavirus outbreak in Asia. And we found this problematic. It was stigmatizing US Chinatowns, which had nothing to do with the outbreak. So we came out very early. But since then, things have gotten worse. Anti-Asian violence and sentiments all over the country have gotten very intense. And now with the shooting, and repeatedly we have issued guidance asking newsrooms to pay attention to this anti-Asian violence, the rise in these sentiments. We have urged newsrooms to take care. We have issued statements denouncing anti-Asian racism, which is not something that we ever thought we had to do, but we did. And I would say all this work really culminated in the past week, it's felt like a year, past week when the shooting happened, we have recently been seeing a lot more coverage of the anti-Asian violence. I think it's gotten to a point where you just can't ignore it anymore because it is so frequent. And it's lately been aimed at the elderly, which is very emotional for a lot of Asian journalists who are covering it, because the victims really remind us of our parents and grandparents who moved here to the US for better lives, and now they're being shoved to the ground and slashed across the face and spat on and yelled at. So we have been really covering this, and then the shooting happened. And initially when the shooting occurred in Atlanta, the police had a press conference, and they quoted the suspect who had told them that the attack was not racially motivated. And they said that the suspect said that it was just sex addiction and he was just having a really bad day, and that it was not racially motivated. And we saw newsrooms rush to really quote the police and say, well, this is not racially motivated because the police said the suspect said so. But if you're Asian American, you know that racism goes hand in hand with sexualization of Asian women and sexual violence against Asian women. And especially in the context of the rising violence against Asians, especially Asian women, like you pointed out at the top, we found this incredibly problematic. And we wanted newsrooms to pay attention and think a little more about the complexities of racism aimed at Asian American communities, especially Asian American women, and teach them that racism doesn't just have to look like one thing, but that it's very intertwined with our lived experience here and the history of how Asian women are perceived by the public, and the hypersexualization of Asian women. So we issued guidance around how to cover the shooting that afternoon, the afternoon after the shooting happened. And it was very clear that newsrooms needed our guidance. We talked about how to talk about racial discrimination against Asian women. We talked about the history of the long history of anti-Asian discrimination in this country. We urged newsrooms to quote AAPI experts, really lean into the people who have been studying this and can talk about this. And we asked newsrooms to take care of our Asian journalists who have been experiencing a lot in this moment. And the guidance got so much attention that it crashed the AAJA website for the first time in 10 years. And it's really gotten spread far and wide, because I think it was clear that newsrooms just did not know how to talk about this in this moment. So that's been the work that we're doing, and we're now continuing to update our guidance to help newsrooms through follow-up coverage of this shooting.
How do you join the AAJA? Excuse me, because people might think you have to be American, Asian, or a journalist to join it. I'm a member of the AAJA, and I'm obviously not American or Asian. So can you explain, how can you join the AAJA?
Well, you can go to aaja.org. You don't have to be Asian to join. You don't have to be American to join. You don't have to be a journalist to join either. We actually have a membership category called Ally to really bring in everyone who supports our mission to diversify newsrooms, to better represent Asians in newsrooms and better represent Asian communities in the news coverage. And we've seen an uptick in Ally membership registrations over the past week, just outpouring of support from people who care about the work that we're doing, because, moments like these, this is when we show the value of the work that we do, because it was very clear that our work was needed, that newsrooms don't have the expertise to handle moments like these. They don't have enough Asians in the newsrooms to speak up about it. And many Asians in US newsrooms right now are still in lower levels. We're very underrepresented the higher you go in management. So the people who really shape the news and direct coverage are not thinking about these issues in the way that they should be.
And Jennifer, you want to ask a follow-up question on the coverage? Yeah,
just picking up what you said. You've mentioned that the AAJA has issued guidance, and we've seen some of the coverage. Some outlets have been putting the names of the victims on the forefront of their coverage, so on their front page or their social media pages, things like that. Do you think that the media has got this right, or do you think coverage is improving? What do you think about it?
Well, unfortunately, there's been another mass shooting since that happened just a week ago in Colorado. There was a shooting yesterday. And I think the the difference in the way the Colorado shooting was covered and the way the Atlanta shooting has been covered has become very clear just in the past 24 hours. We know the names, full lives of most of the victims from yesterday already in Colorado, whereas we still know very little about most of the women who have been killed in the Atlanta shooting. Partly it's the cultural competency of newsrooms that, the cultural incompetency of newsrooms that became clear around the Atlanta shooting. It was clear there were not enough Korean speakers who they could send to the ground. They did not have connections in the Atlanta Korean community. They just did not know how to best cover this. They did it, a lot of newsrooms approach this the same way they do with the many mass shootings we've covered. You background the victims, you find their families' numbers and you call them. But with many of these victims' families and friends, they're among the most invisible members of the Korean community here in Atlanta. And so they're not active. They're not really known throughout the Korean American community here. They don't, you know, they're just not very active. And so that approach was just fundamentally flawed. You know, they're not the type of people who would pick up their phone and talk to an American journalist asking about their friend who was killed. Whereas the Colorado shooting, culturally, it's more, you know, expected for the victims and their families to talk about it. You know, the children of the victims were posting on Twitter that their family member had died. It was just very different in the way that it was handled. And I think over the course of the week after the shooting, we found out more and more about the victims, but we saw many, many failures by US media in covering it, including the way that the names were reported, partly because law enforcement they released partial names. But I think many cultural incompetencies of many US newsrooms came to light from this shooting.
Okay, thank you. Jiayang, welcome.
Hi.
Good to see you again. Welcome back to the FCC and Zoom land. Yeah, thank you. You wrote a very powerful piece for the New Yorker in the wake of the Atlanta shootings. And for those of our audience who haven't read it, and I strongly recommend that they do, the Atlanta shooting and the dehumanizing of Asian women, and the subhead is to live through this period as an Asian American is to feel trapped in an American tragedy while being denied the legitimacy of being an American. So can you explain your feelings that led you to write this article?
Right. So, you know, when on Tuesday night, as the shooting was happening, I was actually getting ready to have dinner with a friend and traveling. I'm in New York City, and traveling has, you know, been fraught for all of us, I think, in the past year because of the pandemic. But for Asian Americans, especially those of us living, well, anywhere, but for me, I mean, in an island as dense as Manhattan, it is impossible to avoid strangers. And the spike in racialized, racist incidents has been dramatic. So as this 21-year-old gunman was, you know, killing 8 people, I was very undecided about whether I even wanted to travel to see a friend for a meal after dark. And it really, to me, signaled this change that this last year has brought, and how frightened so many Asian Americans, including me, have become. And of course, learning about what had happened in Atlanta was horrific, because it made me realize that my fears were not unfounded. I mean, when you do have anxiety about your own safety, you often question if it's paranoia, and the survivalist instinct in Asian Americans, and the invisibility that so many of us have lived with for so long, makes us think that not having been physically injured in the past, as I have not been, they've only been verbal assaults. Perhaps it is all in my head, and I think I was particularly unnerved by the fact that the most deadly of hate crimes, against Asian Americans in recent history happened when I was having an anxiety attack about this exact kind of phenomenon. And it really made me, that piece, when I was writing about it, it made me think deeply about the invisibility of Asian Americans and how defenseless we are against our invisibility, but also how for a long time we never felt we had a right to object to our invisibility. And for Asian American women, it is it is a double bind, because we are in one sense, our immigrant kind of ethnic experience has been, one of not being seen, but we're also hypersexualized. So for a segment of our, lives before we turn, 60 or 55, we live as projections in the American imagination as, dragon ladies, or as, these, or as, women who exhibit and are, empowered by our sexuality. And I find that to be so false and dehumanizing. And this intertwining of misogyny and racism was so horrifically and amply on display in the Atlanta shooting. And for these women who, the victims of the Atlanta shooting, these women who were mostly, between the ages of, 50 and 70, I think about their vulnerability as a function of both their vulnerability, of both of their visibility and invisibility of being Asian American women. And I think about how, a society as deformed as the American one has, pushed them into these, roles where they are, they're, the massage parlors. I mean, they are manual, labor workers. But they probably have very little kind of very few other options to work. And as one of their children have said, their mother felt great shame, and humiliation in what she was doing, but there's so few other options, for them. And then the other, great, irony is that while, this, 21-year-old man, while he felt kind of at complete, liberty to gun them down, he also had said to a friend earlier that he visited these parlors, because these these parlors run by Asian women, because they made him feel safe. And I just think that's so, I think that is just so cruelly ironic that we Asian women have a habit of making others feel safe, even those who kill us in cold blood. So kind of all those thoughts were swirling in me as I wrote that piece. And I think what's and what struck me most deeply, as I read through some of the responses to that piece, is almost every Asian American woman I know has experienced some kind of, sexualized racism, and how, mundane and pervasive that, that sort of experience has been for us, to the extent that we almost brush it off as just part of the American experience. And I think that should really make us question what the American experience is for Asian American women.
I think the date of the killings was the 16th, and the date on the New Yorker piece is the 19th. Can you take us through how you wrote it? Your writing process, was it driven by emotion? I felt angry reading it. You know,
Right.
I mean, I felt angry reading. I mean, you described that situation in the street when you were accosted by this person in the street. I mean, sometimes you get so caught up in a story, there's just this moment you have to sit down and write it. I mean, how did you write it? Was it anger? Was it sadness? Was it how? I mean, it was a very powerful piece, and I think it served a great purpose. It took you right into the reality of the situation from your personal. I mean, you had the big picture, but also your terrible, unpleasant, obviously quite common experience in the street in New York. So what was your actual, as a journalist, sitting in front of your computer, what was the writing process?
Right. I mean, as a journalist, I try not to write purely from emotions, but of course I couldn't help being so emotionally involved in my response to what was happening, and I think it wasn't we wanted a response to the Atlanta shootings fairly quickly, kind of on the New Yorker website. So I think it was just a few hours where I was frantically kind of trying to weave these desperate threads of both presenting what had happened and kind of against the backdrop of this wave of violence being committed against Asian Americans, and specifically what had taken place in Atlanta, and then weaving in my own experience, which I sometimes can be a little bit wary of doing, because I have a tendency to do that quite a lot, because I want my readers to know that my reality isn't necessarily objective, that they are seeing the world through my eyes. And I almost want to present my subjectivity as a way of warning the reader against taking necessarily my reality as the reality. But in this particular experience, since it is about the often under reported experience of Asian American women, I wanted to bring in my personal experience of being a very unpleasant incident on the sidewalk this past summer, of being at first of having a young man at first try to make some kind of a sexual pass at me that very quickly turned racist, as he yelled Ching Chong Kong flu at me, and that incident had always stuck with me because of that microsecond it took him from feeling kind of my failure, feeling my kind of refusal to engage with the sexual advance, to the racist scorn that was his kind of racist slur. So I'm trying to make sense of that, because how do you go from what does it mean to go from this this very tiny smidgen of sexual interest to this dehumanization of another human being? And as a journalist, I found that very interesting, even though as a person it is it's incredibly degrading. So I want to incorporate that into the story, because I'm sure I'm not the only Asian American woman to have experienced it. And also this is coming at a time in a year where so many of us Asian Americans, men and women, have been experiencing various kinds of racist incidents, and trying to make sense of why that is happening, how that's happening. And certainly as I write in the piece, as a woman, and maybe as an immigrant and as an Asian, immediately my question is, what did I do to provoke this? How could have I, prevented it. And it is a nonsensical question, but also I think a human one, because, and especially I think a very Asian American immigrant one, because you feel like there's so little that's within your control when you land in a foreign country. So you want to believe that the mistake is yours, because as long as the mistake is yours, you have some way of being able to correct yourself and then the situation. And I don't mention this, I don't go into this into the piece, but I think it has, but the Atlanta shootings has made me think about the generational divide among Asian Americans and the way that we respond to, these horrific crimes. Those of my mother's generation would always, persist in asking me, well, how did you not see this coming? Or, why, could you have done better to circumvent this? And the younger generation thinks, no, we are, not only are we, are we women, Asian Americans, we are citizens of this country, and we have fundamental rights, and it is not up for, it's not up to us to constantly question ourselves, how could we do better? It's for us to also ask the country that we call our home, how can you do better?
Jennifer?
Yeah, I just want to use that to open up the floor to everyone and just ask, why do you believe there's such hatred and anger towards Asian Americans? We do have a question from Peter, who cited a report saying that Asian Americans had the highest household income above others. So do you think? So do you think it's kind of financial envy? What is it? Why is there such vitriol towards the community?
I wonder if I could jump in on that. One is, that's not actually an accurate statistic, because it's Asian American is, of course, in a very large amorphous descriptor of people from both different ways of migration, as well as different countries of origin. And it not only has the highest household income, it also has the lowest household income. So it is within a group, it's actually the most differentiated, right? So but Peter is right that is the stereotype of a certain kind of Asian American, which we have abundantly used model minority. What Jiayang just said actually reminded me, I've been holding these informal conversations with former students, just opening up space for people to talk. And one of my students last night, in fact, said to me that I've asked them how their parents have been perceiving this. And one of my students said to me that his parents did exactly as Jiayang described, told him to stay out of trouble. My mom also called me to tell me to stay out of trouble. And he said they think of it as an immigrant tax. They think of it as something they have to pay, in order to have the right to exist. And I think it's absolutely right that maybe for many of us, we don't feel we don't have that burden in the same way. However, I did want to say that I don't think this is that this kind of pushback is also part of the myth of Asians as passive, right? That from the very onset, I think one thing we've learned so much about, and thanks to like AAJA and Michelle and so many great journalists, Jiayang, who've been covering it, we've learned a lot about the victimhood, and it's good because it needs to be front and center. But one thing that gets covered even less in Asian American victimhood is Asian American activism. And Asian Americans were the first labor strikes during the railroad workers, but we never heard about that. Asian Americans in the 10 years after Exclusion Act passed, put onto the docket more than 7,000 protests against the Exclusion Act. And most of them, in fact, won, mostly on the grounds of habeas corpus. Asians challenged the Supreme Court, challenged the US Constitution, the amendment, and Wong Kim Ark, of course, in 1898, was really his challenge to birthright citizenship, was what solidified and kind of, set the precedent. We've had, pushbacks against internment. We've had pushbacks against, violence after Vincent Chin. We've had labor strikes. I guess what I'm saying is that that's what's not covered, right? That the so-called Chinatown history and Asian American history is also one about a kind of activist working class history. And one of the voices that has emerged, and I think is thanks to good journalists who have been amplifying them, are sex worker organizations within Chinatowns, right? That so like Red Canary, for example, that a lot of people have heard about now, Red Canary song. And to be able to say, we do care about these invisible women. It's that you haven't given us the platform to care. So I did want to get that out there, but also really push back against the idea that whatever Asian Americans have is coming for them is deserved somehow because they are wealthy and elite. We're looking at elderly grannies getting beat up on the streets of San Francisco Chinatown. You know, why is this somehow equated to the Ivy League Asian who goes to Goldman Sachs, right? I mean, I'm not sure like why we have to make that equivalence.
Michelle, we have a question from Simran Vinod Baswani who says, and you spoke about one of the problems in the Atlanta coverages was just, I mean, it was a basic thing of languages and access to the Korean community. And it says, what can smaller newsrooms, specifically those that don't necessarily have the adequate resources, do to ensure culture, inclusivity and competency in their coverage, more diversity basically in newsrooms? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think what this shooting really showed us is that newsrooms can do more year-round to prepare themselves and educate themselves in case of moments like these, but also to better cover communities around them. And there are plenty of resources like AAJA. There are, we have many partner organizations that could help those newsrooms bring those resources to them and help their journalists throughout the year, just kind of be better acquainted with the experiences and history of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. I think one of the things that we realize is that over the past year, as the racial justice protests here in Atlanta, here in America, have really grown around after the killing of George Floyd, there were racial justice and social justice protests all over the country, and newsrooms became more aware that they should not rely solely on police narrative when it comes to the killing of Black men, unarmed Black men, and that journalists should question what the police are telling them and be more mindful of the experience of Black Americans. But what we learned in the past week is that newsrooms are still unequipped to ask those questions, interrogate police statements when it comes to other communities, especially AAPI communities. So what that means is they really need to take proactive action to help their newsroom get educated throughout the year, whether it's bringing in more historians to speak with journalists, leaning on organizations like AAJA. There's plenty that they can do. And another thing that newsrooms can do, and that's really been made clear this week, is that ethnic media who are really based in these local communities among AAPI communities are truly they're a gem. I would say the local Korean media here in Atlanta has been kicking national media's butts when it comes to this coverage. And they've been way out in the front because they know exactly who to talk to and where the sources are. And if newsrooms made better attempts to connect with local media, just develop relationships with them, I think it would go a long way in terms of really amping up their coverage when it comes to communities that are often overlooked.
Thanks. Jiayang, you've really been on the firing line. I mean, you wrote that very powerful piece this week, but also when you wrote about your mother situation, you were attacked by Chinese trolls from the mainland. Could you maybe talk about that? And I mean, how do you deal? You seem to be getting it from both sides.
Yeah, I know. It is one of the great joys of being a journalist that you in the social media age that your enemies can really, that those who have animosity toward you can be from every point on the spectrum, and and social media really democratizes that, their ability to very visibly attack you. I think that actually, indicative of what it means to be, you know, a Chinese American female journalist. I was really appalled ever so often. I check the lists I'm on Twitter, which I don't recommend doing if you are a journalist. And one of them is just one of them is Fuzzy Little Foreigners, and it's it's me and a lot of other non-white journalists. And then the most recent one that honored me was called Bitches, and it was just all Asian American female journalists, ethnically ethnically Chinese, and that's probably not a surprise to many of you, but there is but I as a journalist, I do find it kind of sociologically interesting, the attack that comes from every which side, which is both race, cultural, and sex-based. And I feel it sometimes from fellow Asian Americans who make lists targeted exclusively at Asian American female journalists, and their greatest grievance seems to be that we have too much of a voice, that we are being too aggressive, and that we have bold opinions about both the US and China, and that we are not swallowing the narrative as it comes from either China or the US. And writing that piece about my mother and me, I mean, our situation is particularly unique, but I also think it is a very American story of an immigrant mother who wishes the best for her daughter, who wants to move heaven and earth to ensure an education, the only social capital that she identifies as as a currency in this new country, and the daughter who grows up with a fusion of Chinese and American values, but ultimately just wants to feel the freedom of being her own person as a writer, and as an independent human. And that, I think, is very difficult to assert, especially in a time of uncertainty when tribalism of every which stripe pressurizes so many of us to seek identification with one group or another. And for someone like me, who has always resisted, or has actually over time, I think, through kind of reflection about the kind of writer I want to be, felt that my allegiance has only ever been and will only ever be to my writing self. I think I can almost understand how that feels like a betrayal, even though I object to that classification, but I can understand the fact that I will not put my loyalty to Chinese or Americans, or any other group ahead of my wanting to fully grasp a situation, a phenomenon, a story on its own basis. That means that I cannot be counted on, that my vote hasn't been prefigured, and I understand how that's frightening, but I also feel enormous gratitude for the ability to be a Chinese American, Asian American journalist. I can't imagine that a generation earlier that there necessarily would have been a room for someone like me. So that gratitude is always, I think, balanced with an idealism that the situation can be better, and the wish that every single time I open Twitter, there, were not, hate messages and groups, that includes me, labeled, bitches.
You talked, Jiayang just spoke about tribalism. Michelle, I'd like to ask you this question. There's a report just, I'm quoting the Washington Post back to you, but when the virus started came out, on March 16th, 2020, Donald Trump first tweeted the phrase China virus. And that single tweet, quoting the Post, researchers later found fueled exactly the kind of backlash that WHO had feared. It was followed by an avalanche of tweets using the hashtag China virus and all the others that we don't need to repeat. And also, if you look at Fox News, if you look at Tucker Carlson, even the way he was talking about Atlanta, how can you deal with this avalanche of racism that's coming from the Republican Party, coming from Fox News, is fueled by Donald Trump? I mean, Michelle, I mean, how do Asian Americans get past this? How can you confront it?
Well, I think, as Eileen noted earlier, this is not new. Anti-Asian rhetoric may feel more scornful right now, and particularly around China virus, Kung flu, such terms. But I think it is important to talk about the fact that this is not new. This is a part of our lived experience in this country. And I would also say, I've been saying that this past year has been a difficult year to be Asian in America. It's been a difficult year to be a journalist in America. And it's been really difficult to be an Asian American journalist in America. We've had journalists who are out in the field reporting, who are being yelled at, being called China virus, being called Kung flu. We have a reporter who covers the White House who was called Kung flu, and that was one of the instances that was picked up very widely. Our journalists have been out there every day covering the news while facing the racism, as Jiayang said, not just online, but in person. And I think it is really on us to talk about it more. It's so important to write about this stuff and for us to share our experiences. And as Asians and as journalists, we're not really wired to talk about ourselves or our experiences, but we've seen how far that's taken us, and this is where we are now. And what needs to change, I think what we're all coming around to is we're so tired of the invisibility. We're tired of keeping these experiences to ourselves. This needs to be talked about. It needs to become the norm for journalists to share what it's like to be AAPI journalists during this moment, so that the rest of the country is aware. It's become clear to me that in the past several months, people who are not Asian are now realizing, oh, Asians face racism? Oh, interesting. And that's not right. We should be talking about this over and over and raising the awareness. At AAJA, we're trying to be more vocal about this for this reason, because we want to speak up for our journalists. We want to speak up for our experiences and for our communities, and also support AAPIs through mental health support during this time too, because again, journalists are not good at talking about their feelings. Asians specifically are not well equipped to talk about our feelings in real time. Mental health support is still pretty stigmatized in many communities. We want to change that. We want to make it so that it's out in the open, that it's okay to be human and a journalist at the same time, because those two things coexist, and we should be talking about it more. And we're huge proponents of just bringing as much visibility to our communities and to our journalists as possible, because it's clear that's still very much needed.
Jennifer, you got a kind of big picture question.
Yeah, just it's a question I kind of want to pose to Eileen. Thinking about the Asian American experience and what's happened over the past week, to what extent can we apply this to other Asian diasporas across the world? And what can those communities overseas do to express solidarity? To what extent can we apply the Asian American experience to those communities, and what can they do to help each other?
Right, thank you. As Jennifer pointed out, this is the anti-Asian violence or rhetoric has not been limited to the US, right, in the past year, and also has a long history everywhere. And I guess a couple different things. One is, I think it's to to understand the story, understand the history of the ways in which Asians have been dehumanized, Asian women have been sexualized throughout, you could say, the Western empires, the British Empire, et cetera, and to situate the US story within that larger discourse. A scholar named Jason Fung in the beginning of 2020 started cataloging all sorts of anti-Asian incidents, right, violence. And but the UK was particularly high, as well as Italy when COVID-19 first exploded there. So, people were vulnerable in Europe, in other places. There was also, to be frank, also anti-Chinese sentiment in other parts of Asia, right? Chinese workers, laborers perceived as carriers of disease in South Korea and Japan, et cetera. So I think there's no way around racial hatred and violence except to articulate it, to speak out, to always point it out, to always listen to each other's stories, and to also realize the ways in which they come from a much larger, when there's a kind of anti-Asian violence in the UK, for example, Asian meaning, of course, encompassing South Asian and Middle Eastern, I think one of the pushbacks that I've found fairly inspiring is we are here because you were there, right? That I think you can never talk about the US or Europe and its anti-Asian sentiments without talking about a larger and longer history of colonialism and empire, and the ways in which a lot of these things about, say, hypersexualization of women are baked into that story. So that it is baked into these stories of these nations. Back to the US, as an example, I think people want to talk, people mention Madame Butterfly or geisha girls or all these kinds of ways in which Asian women are stereotyped. But perhaps the less discussed story is that miscegenation and laws around miscegenation were always part of the American narrative even before America became America. So in 1661 was the first anti-miscegenation law prohibiting non-white men from marrying white women, right? So, so you have this history that goes much longer, and then you have the Page Act of 1875. But a lot of that suspicion of Chinese women entering the country, prohibited by Page law, was a perception that they were prostitutes in colonial spaces in the British Empire, right? So, so all this is entangled and enmeshed and together. And not limited to one country's story, even though it's very much part of the US story.
So we are running out of time, I'm afraid. I have a question from Christy Lou Stout. Looking forward, she said, Christy Lou Stout from CNN, said that's the amount, $300 million. That's the amount more than 180 Asian American organizations are asking to have added to the next federal budget to fight anti-Asian discrimination. If granted, what should that money go toward? To end AAPI hate. So who would like to take that one? Michelle? What could you spend money on that could you buy your way out of this hatred?
I think Eileen might be better equipped to talk about this.
Eileen?
Money is always good, but I feel like maybe one of the ways is to support all these grassroots organizations, right? Not just give to really, really big established organizations, but people who have been doing work in communities. Like I mentioned Red Canary Song, I mentioned CCED in LA, the Butterfly Group. There are many tenants' rights groups. There's a Save Chinatown Coalition in New York. So to take a page from formerly Madeline Bezos, gosh, I forgot her main name, but I mean that kind of way of really targeted, intentional giving, right? That really allows for, that makes big impacts on small organizations rather than a big lump sum to some big organization. And of course, support the AAJA.
Yeah, support us so that our website doesn't crash next time.
And Jiayang, I mean, in New York, I mean, do you see any? Is it going to get worse or better? Or, I mean, I mean, do you think the Atlanta killings has raised awareness of the seriousness of the situation? I mean, just living in the city.
Tragedies have been happening at such a rapid clip. It's really difficult, I think, to tell at this point. But I do think that the response, I mean, the way that the news cycle has been, I mean, at least up until yesterday, has been dominated by what's happening at Atlanta. I mean, on the one hand, it's painful that it takes a tragedy of this magnitude to bring attention to the plight of Asian Americans, and especially Asian American women working at the margins. But I also, going back to that question about where that money should be spent, I think about, I think a lot of that money should be spent on, the most vulnerable members of our community. And I think I mean, I don't exactly have, a 10-step plan, but in terms of the kind of, it takes a lot of resources to draw out, I think about the woman like my mother's health aide, who are, Chinese immigrants who, really live very insulated but unprotected lives, if that makes any sense. They're insulated by their lack of language and by their socioeconomic conditions, but they're unprotected in the sense that they are at the mercy of family members who can translate for them and who can go on the internet maybe to find jobs for them. And I think about how complicated it is sometimes even to deliver the resources to them that they need. I mean, it's not just about, I think for them, it's quite frightening to have a non-Chinese social worker show up at their door and, make them fill out a bunch of forms and say, okay, let's get you some help. And sometimes that can be even a little bit patronizing. I think what's needed is, as a first step, is understanding. I think about kind of, in a way, my mother's illness has, for me, been a window into the lives of these women, of which I think I count my mother as a member. But it's not just about, kind of this one-stop shop of bringing them help. It's about, it's about the intertwining of, the shame of mental illness, the shame of poverty, the inability to fully find the resources, they need, and then, lack of, basic financial literacy. All of that is intertwined, and it makes them exceedingly vulnerable. And I think understanding their situation, and sometimes that that means giving them kind of a safe space. Hiring social workers that can come in just to understand kind of the basic dynamic of their living circumstances, to then come up with a plan to sensitively deliver the kind of help that they might need. I mean, that itself, I think, would take a lot of resources. And that money, I mean, it's not going to be like the value of that is not going to be readily apparent the next day, but that's the kind of help I think that's particularly that accrues over time. And that is, I think, very, very essential. And I think we need to think about that, how to reach out to these women, and a lot of them do live in urban enclaves in New York City, and other immigrant dense cities in the U.S. So yes, not a lot of concrete targeted solutions, but I would love it if we could make a gesture in that direction.
Okay, thank you. So we have a tradition. I mean, at the end of a very intense discussion, and we could talk all night or all day. I'm afraid we have to wrap it up. I'd like to thank the people who sent us questions that we didn't have time for. So Jennifer, can you finish the discussion?
Yeah, so at the end we like to ask our speakers if you have any books that you're reading. What are you reading? And do you have any recommendations for our audiences? Eileen, we can see that you've got a lot of books behind you. Maybe you can pick your favorite one, or anyone that you're reading at the moment.
I know this is such classic Professor Zoom, right? So So I've returned to a favorite collection of essays by Alexander Chi in the last weeks because it's almost acquired incontemporary power for me. But the final essay in his collection, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, Alexander Chi is a queer Korean American writer, also a powerhouse writing teacher. But his last essay is called On Becoming American Writer in this. And I just want to read you one sentence from it. It says, "Write for your dead. Tell them a story. What are you doing with this life? Let them hold you accountable." And he also says, write for the ones you love and the ones who are coming for your life. And I feel like this week I've returned to this passage over and over again, and reminding me what needs to be done and what needs to be said, and the stories we should tell.
Okay, thank you. Michelle?
Well, so personally, I'm reading The Two Koreas by Dawn Oberdorfer, which is basically a textbook for anyone who's about to cover the Koreas, which is what I'm going to start this summer as Tokyo Bureau Chief. But I do want to make two book recommendations, especially in terms of understanding this moment from the Asian American perspective. One is Asian American Dreams by Helen Zia, well-known author and activist, especially in documenting the death of Vincent Chin and the activism that ensued after that. And also want to recommend One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, The Epic Struggle Over American Immigration, 1924 to 1965, which is by another AAJA member, Jiayang, who's national editor at the New York Times. That was just such a fascinating book because I feel like it covers a time in history that's not really well known in terms of the American immigration history and the fight for immigrant rights. And it's a really fascinating and new book. Wanted to make a plug for that.
Jiayang?
Yeah, hi. I have the book. It's actually on my it's within it's within reach. I'm currently reading this new it just came out, Land of Big Numbers by a friend and fellow Asian American Chinese American journalist, De-Ping Chen, and it is actually, I think, was written while she was a journalist in China, and it's about China rather than Chinese America for the most part. I mean, I'm not totally through it right now, but I think so much of the dehumanizing of Asian Americans comes from a lack of understanding, even from some of my non-Chinese friends about China. And I find I find novels and short story collections about contemporary China to be very edifying, because they serve to humanize this country of 1.4 billion. And I think built into racism is this implicit notion that these other people, they can't possibly share the same complex human experience that I have. And I think that is also built into slurs like the China flu and the Kong flu. It is a way of othering and of degrading someone else, and I really encourage as much reading about contemporary China, especially at a time when, as all of us present probably knows, the Sino-American relationship is not at its peak. So I think trying to understand the experience of people on the other side of the world, kind of outside the political tensions, I think that's more valuable now than ever.
And actually, T-Ping Chen spoke about the Land of Big Numbers at the FCC yesterday. So if you would like to see her, yeah, I can send you the link.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it was yesterday morning our time. So we're delighted to host her. So thank you. I'm sorry we came together in such bad circumstances, but it was a fascinating discussion. So thank you. And we hope to talk to you again soon. And I would just like to say, stay safe. I mean, we've got a lot of challenges. So, and it was a very important discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.